I taught
Professional
for
loosely, right?
yeah, I've taught large lectures for over a decade, so I'm used to talking. But
How long have you been lecturing?
since 2000 well, technically as a lecturer, but I was teaching like basketball and PE type classes in maybe 2010, and then I think 2011 is when I started like lecture format classes.
And
Yeah.
was it in regards to, I mean, how did you get started with the concussion program?
Let's see, in 2008, I was working on a master's thesis, and there was someone here at the time who I was on a grant with doing concussion and depression research in high school and collegiate athletes. And his name was Anthony Contos. And then there's Justice Ortega, who's also been around for quite a while at the university, longer than me by a few years, but was there during that time when I was working on my master's thesis. So I was doing concussion and depression research in high school and collegiate athletes, working with CR, HSU, McKinleyville, and Fortuna High under a grant for a couple of years. I was coaching basketball at CR at the time separately. And then when I finished my master's thesis, Contos had already left Humboldt. And Justice and I kind of continued the program when the grant ran out. It was sort of an opportunity to extend the best practices and care, more largely in the community. And certainly, I think would have been a reduction in care for the schools and athletes that had been participating, up until that date as a part of the grant. So we sort of pushed to keep the program going. So that was 2008, 9, 10. 11, and then at that same time when I finished coaching at CR, let's see, 7, 8, 8, 9, 9, 10, and 10, I picked up lecturing classes at the university, just UPE classes to kind of also have that. So I have a faculty lecturer role and also a staff concussion role, and they do overlap.
And almost
But
perfectly fit for concussions because you're around these students, you're around these athletes, you kind of get to see it. You were coaching. So
yeah.
I would assume you were no stranger to seeing kids kind of get thumped on a little bit.
Sure. I grew up playing sports, and I'm one of 10 girls on one side, but my nickname was like grandson, which my cousins also played, Division II hockey, so ice hockey's girl cousins. So it's not like I was, more tomboy than anybody else, but certainly used to it. And used to say that I've never really wished I were a boy, but the only reason that I wished that I were a boy was so that I could play and coach college football. I thought that for quite a while. So I'm also very familiar just as a growing up around even contact sports that I didn't play.
Did that, is that kind of what primed you to go down this field? As you've just been adjacent to it and in it and thought, maybe I should look into what happens when you get your head hit?
It's hard to. It's always hard to say, and who knows why exactly, or the route. I had a circuitous route to here into concussion specifically, but not necessarily. I certainly was into health, the human body, understanding the brain. Always like a kind of med nerd. Thought I wanted to do pre-med. Pediatric oncology, went into juvenile advocacy, went to law school at Tulane, but didn't want to be a lawyer. Dropped out because I didn't want to be a lawyer, but loved being in New Orleans at Tulane. I had Saints season tickets the year after Katrina, right when we got Reggie Bush. I got season tickets for like $225 or something, and I kept them through for a number of years. And anyway, so I was kind of in those realms. My mom suffered a severe traumatic brain injury when I was 14. We were riding bikes and she was hit by a car. So certainly that probably, anyone who hears that goes, oh, that's why you, and it's hard to say. I think I was interested and then also more personally interested in the relevance of what happens to the brain through brain injury. So always kind of floating in those circles. And then when I dropped out of law school and wanted to come here, my parents used to come here, run the Avenue of the Giants marathon. So it's kind of like I had this always as another, I was either going to go to New Orleans or, like up here kind of thing. So when I came here and started coaching, I was clerking for a family law judge at the time and working at the Larapin and a real estate place. Decided to do my master's and then just coincidentally, Contos, who was doing concussion work, he was more of a sports psych guy, but was getting into the concussion from the concussion and depression side. He evacuated here from New Orleans. So we were in New Orleans at the same time. We didn't know each other. I met him here, and we had like a couple close circles, and then it, grew out of that opportunity. So yeah, long, circuitous.
Funny how life works out like
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah. So, and it's been going since.
2008. I mean, I would imagine that the field of concussion research has changed dramatically since then.
Yeah, just our knowledge of the brain even and has changed dramatically. In 2008, there were a few kind of circles of people who were doing concussion research, but Contos and his colleagues in Michigan, and then now in kind of Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh at the time, really only a small handful gets a small handful of people working on it from those angles and initially.
Were you surprised when you started doing that research in regards to concussions and depression, how drastic the connection was? I mean, was there a pretty strong connection long term with that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, just as a vague answer to concussions and depression, yeah, sure, there's a strong correlation between brain injury and mental health, and also playing into whatever sort of individual differences are probably working. Also, was I surprised? Maybe not. Maybe not surprised. Uh, it maybe made sense to me at that time or by that time. It's certainly not a comfortable thing to really like let set in, and that was sort of like the initial foray. So yeah, or my initial foray into it was from that perspective.
And where do
Yeah.
concussions rank on the TBI spectrum? I know that there's mild, moderate, and severe.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, from a clinical standpoint, you have to have some sort of diagnostic criteria. You need to be able to define things and what you mean by things. If someone admits to an ER, it's obviously relevant to weed them out from like a emergency head issue versus a stable stable brain trauma kind of thing. But really within the field, we've even gotten away from calling them mild traumatic brain injuries. It's like concussions have largely been grouped as mild traumatic brain injuries. And that's because compared to severe traumatic brain injuries with extended loss of consciousness or other types of severe amnesia or coma, bleeds and swells, they're mild in the acute stages, as in they're not as life-threatening acutely. And so they've always been sort of lumped towards mild. But what that really does is give people a false impression. I always try to kind of say, and so it's important, and we have to do that. We have done that. We have called them mild. We do still say mild, moderate, and severe. It's not totally helpful. We're getting away from it for a lot of reasons. I say to people, like, you tell me, kid gets, or an adult gets knocked out. It's super obvious. The game, whatever, stops. They come out, they're checked out, they do nothing for a week, they're watched, and then they can slowly grade back in. It seems like, no big deal at the time, or like an easy recovery at the time. Was that mild? Or what about someone who has no specific recollection of what exactly it was after a few weeks or games or practices? They have chronic headaches and kind of debilitating mood swings that are now leading them to have to withdraw from a semester of school and seek, immediate psychological counseling. But there was no obvious initial thing. Is that mild? So mild, because it's an invisible injury and it's so easy to mismanage, even when you know about it. That's what we do kind of as humans. It's not helpful for someone to think of it acutely as something that's mild. Certainly the effects that people see for people who've had reoccurring mild injuries are not mild, in the long run. So,
Well, it's one of those injuries, like you said, where it's not physically apparent. Like if you break
yeah,
your arm and your hand's twisted backwards, people
yeah,
would say, "Oh yeah, we should probably have something done about this."
yeah,
But if you get knocked out, or if you get the wind knocked out of you, or
yeah,
hit your head and you bounce back up, and even if you keep playing and you're in a sport,
yeah.
nobody bats an eye.
No,
Just
yeah.
go back to what you were doing.
And who doesn't, like, I talk to people who say, In soccer and heading as a defensive athlete, and kids that have gone on to even play semi-pro. And how many times a game do you think you're heading the ball? These like high flighted clears, like, a dozen. I don't know, 24 on average. And how do you feel? Do you ever get headaches? Oh yeah, like I take half a dozen Advil after every game, always, my whole career. And
It's
like
kind of terrifying.
like to hear high school kids here say to each other, like, but is it different than the headaches we always have after every, that's when I'm really like, that feels not so great. Just because that's also when the brain is still developing. So that's a big clash, just sort of like what, we see it, everything happens trickle down. Everyone focuses first on the pros and then college and then kids, and it should work absolutely in the other direction, and they see things sort of emulated and try to do that, and they don't have any of the training or the control or whatever. And really the issues that those adults are having started when they were kids.
And then just builds up throughout your time playing.
Yeah, your brain is still developing. And I guess to circle back to your initial question about where do they fall on the TBI spectrum, they are traumatic brain injuries. So, a concussion is a traumatic brain injury. It's different than a brain trauma from like a stroke or an aneurysm. It's caused by outside forces acting to shake the brain inside the skull, which, doesn't just cause the brain to like hit the skull, but different parts of the brain are different densities, right? So if you've heard of things like white matter and gray matter, or if you've seen a cross-section of a brain or a picture of a brain, it's not just like one rugby ball lump of jello, right? There are different bits and pieces, and it looks like there are more folds up here and fewer folds in here. And that translates to, density and then the properties of physics and how they work through different densities of not solid, semi-liquid, tissues. And so those shake and jostle and pull and stretch. And it's actually, a mechanical injury to the structures of what's effectively the electrical networks, in your jello mold. If you imagine, like 100 billion neurons, and they're even a small portion of the total mass of the brain. So 100 billion neurons make 1,000 trillion connections. So imagine like an electrical network, that kind of tiny packed in there. And it makes sense, the, normal chemistry things you've heard about, like sodium and potassium and calcium, things that people hear about later, like tau proteins, if you've heard about like tauopathies or, amyloid beta or beta amyloid, proteins or plaques or things. All of those things occur naturally in the brain. And so we've long understood the brain by understanding what happens during either like injury or disease states. And brain injury and traumatic brain injury is one of those. We still don't have sophisticated technologies to observe in the living in real time, what's happening. But we're pretty confident about a lot of the things, based both in human and in animal research as well. We're the same as the zebrafish and the fruit flies, and it's the same. So, from that perspective, from the structural and mechanical and kind of chemical standpoint.
And so when you experience a concussion, what is happening in your brain? Is it just a disruption of those neural pathways, a temporary block in blood flow? What's going on?
Yeah, less of you can kind of think block in blood flow, but what's happening is called or at least in large part, a neurometabolic cascade. So, we're concerned less with the initial, brother with a baseball bat to the head. I think brothers are a big risk factor for concussion, I've found anecdotally. Not myself, but 3 years of work.
I think I can back that up.
Yeah.
I think my sister would say the same thing.
Yeah. So it's not the initial, whatever trauma, it's that then causes a disruption to the functioning of these electrical networks, which work by basic chemistry and electricity, or not basic, but chemistry and electricity. Your question of, okay, what's happening? So a lot of things, and during this neurometabolic cascade, you have a supply and demand crisis with getting energy to the brain, because in part of cerebral blood flow and other things, the actual mechanical stretching of the architecture of those wires, et cetera, as it were, causes a disruption in the sodium, like the ion channels, the way that the ions go back and forth through the membranes, the way that the proteins that make up the structure of the wires sort of fold and cleave and misfold, the way that they get, when those things happen kind of in small states and maybe on occasion, the way the brain would work is to, in parts, like gobble up the dysfunctional stuff and kind of resituate. But if it happens, looks like enough in a single event, maybe a severe traumatic brain injury, or in repetitive milder traumatic brain injuries, they can go into more chronically disrupted states. So we know that this neurometabolic cascade, this like what we'll call a window of vulnerability, while things are going haywire sort of at every turn in your brain, and while your brain is having to work harder just to do the normal stuff like bat your eyes and ignore noises and, keep you upright and things like that, process information, it's working harder to do that, having a harder time doing that, not succeeding at that as well. The symptoms of concussion, cross every parameter, physical stuff, sleep stuff, mood stuff, cognitive stuff. And so while that is still vulnerable and dysfunctional, you're more at risk for subsequent injury or for exacerbating the current injury. We know, and in like an isolated injury, it's safe to say that takes weeks to resolve. And the more you have, the closer they are together. Like those aren't separate injuries. It gets more complicated. We're talking about like a clean once-off taking weeks or more to resolve. And then, add more time as you get younger and as you have more injuries. And anyone who grew up playing sports knows that that's a far stretch from what happens even still. So that's the gig, is it's this wave of disruption affects everything, takes time to resolve. And we don't often, get that or give it that. One of the sort of like most somber things I can remember initially going to a conference, Chris Nowinski, he played football at Harvard, and he went on to I always screw this up, but it's the slightly more real one, the WWF. Yeah.
I don't know. Is that in reference to like the WWE?
EF, yeah,
Okay.
like maybe
One of those
maybe
pro
early
wrestling
2000s,
yeah.
yeah, like from Harvard football. He was like I think mid-20s, early 20s, and he was like forced to retire because he was like acting out dreams violently in his sleep. He was having real lasting and headaches and other mood disruption, sleep disruption symptoms from football and professional, fighting or whatever. And he went on to, because of his connections, he's helped start and work with some brain banks to go talk to athletes about donating their brains eventually. And he's worked with Anne McKee in Boston, who is sort of one of the paramount researchers related to studying the pathophysiology or brain's postmortem of people with, now you've probably heard of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is degenerative brain diseases specifically, which is a degenerative brain condition specifically related to repetitive and mismanaged mild traumatic brain injuries. So it's really about repetitive injury.
And I think that's the big one everybody thinks of when you think long-term repeated blows to the head is CTE.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that can only be diagnosed post-mortem, right?
Definitively, currently. There are some more like early kind of like, based on good evidence and probability, some helpful diagnostic tools. Like if someone is presenting and it seems pretty obvious, now we at least know there are ways to try to help treat the symptoms. And some, they're looking for biomarkers, but part of it maybe is interesting or maybe it's not interesting, but you think about a lot of the ways that we could get at some of these populations, they would be professional athletes. And so when we're seeing these numbers in professional athletes, that doesn't mean that we necessarily have a good control based on people who haven't played contact sports their entire life, right? Or like military veterans who haven't been exposed to repetitive blast injuries and maybe also played contact sports. So, we don't have 200,000 people, or not that many, but we don't have like a standard people who had a life of no impact. in some of those ways to see if the biomarkers, for example, like some of the tau proteins or whatever, would be helpful as a diagnostic tool right now. And that's already changing. Like they're getting a lot of that. We just have to have years of enough research to show that they're useful. They're close in some of those things. Certainly people purporting to be able to, diagnose using this or that. But none of it's totally definitive unless it's a postmortem at this point.
So the heading the ball example, I think, is a really good one because most people probably wouldn't think of that as having long-term effects. Oh, like, oh, you're just hitting the ball with your head. Nobody's knocking you out. You're not getting laid out flat. You're just hitting the ball. Like,
Yeah.
that's not a big deal.
Yeah. One paper that's really helpful to consider with that is specifically what was found is that it's hits, not concussions, that cause CTE. So it's really a rethinking. When I started talking about Chris Nowinski, I said one of the sort of most sombering moments was listening to him talk at a conference in 2005, and as part of his PowerPoint, I think it was '05, and he said, it was at the Society for Neuroscience, he said this quote on the board, and it's something to the extent of, I'm paraphrasing, but brain injuries are a big concern. We should be worried about our athletes. It could have long-term health effects. We need to be cautious about this and do something, essentially. And it was dated the, 17th annual NCAA Coaches Commission. And everyone in the room, me included, was like, yes, oh my God, yes, yes. Next slide. That commission was in 1934.
Wow.
I still am just like, like, think about that. I mean, with like zero technology or, know-how or knowledge, we knew, and so that is still like, just as someone who loves sports, grew up loving sports, wants to love everything about being involved in sports, as youth. We don't, as a researcher, there's something as far as informed consent. We don't let people under 18 make decisions about their life under any circumstance. We don't let them vote. We don't trust them. We charge more for car insurance. They don't get to drink alcohol. Why do we think that they get to be the ones to make very long-term decisions about their health? And also to that, why do we think that parents get to be the ones to make those decisions for them? They can't have informed consent. And even college athletes, that's what the college athletes and the pros are hashing out. It's like, you didn't tell us. You knew, and you didn't tell us. We were not agreeing, fully knowing. And even the people who say, oh, I know I'm going to get beat. They do. There are a lot more people going, I knew, but you knew more. And had I known, I maybe would have chosen differently. And that's the part that's
stings the most.
Super finds up to me. Yeah. So.
Do you think they didn't want players to know how severe it was long term?
Completely. Oh yeah.
Just out of fear of losing
Still,
players.
Right now, today. Yeah. I mean, the NFL, anyone else, that's just an easy recent target, has all the money in the world to settle a lawsuit. No one can take them to court. And they didn't. The whatever $700 million, whatever it was, settlement, and the money that they're donating to research, that's just buying them time. They're settling because there's no discovery, then there's no actual lawsuit where they look into the evidence and the discovery and it's all hashed out. They're like, this is the money we have. We'll put these safety protocols in place. It's all a risk management strategy to say, and some of it's maybe honest self-delusion. That's also interesting from a brain perspective and how we do that as humans. So I still am a positive person. I want to go, some of them just love it that much they can't see, and maybe that's true. But it's absolutely a strategic way to just ride this as long as possible and get as much money out of it as possible. And that's not just the NFL, but that's an easy and obvious recent example. Yeah.
Is there a balance that could be struck that, maybe if you don't play as a kid but play as an adult when your brain is fully developed, that you wouldn't have these side effects? Or is it just once you start engaging in it and get repeated trauma, you're you're kind of screwed.
It would be a lot better. I can tell you for sure, even holding off. Like, we know that in an 8-year-old, like, the relative G forces are actually greater in an 8-year-old. I mean, they're bobbleheads, right? You're on average, what, like, body's 90% of its full size, or head is 90% of its full size, and your body's like 40%. And like, you don't have the strength or the structure or the equipment or the coaches or yada, 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 yada. So those in head-to-head hits in like little kids, the relative G forces are greater than they are for like a professional athlete. And that's like incrementally true. Actually, the evidence that we have shows that, that's true in little kids, also in like middle school, high school, college. And it really, so the question of like, yeah, best thing to do now would just be like, we love football, so we agree, like no contact football. Even if if you said 14, it would help. That's arbitrary. There's nothing different about a 14-year-old brain. Not in college if it wasn't, or high school if it wasn't necessary. I know you're like, well, how would you prepare for college? I don't have those answers. It definitely would take a total reframing, but they're starting to do some of that by just not having hitting practices as often, which is helpful.
Is that realistically helpful, or is
It
it
is
just
in limiting the total number of hits. Same way we don't take a jugs machine and shoot it at people for soccer ball headers anymore. Soccer heading, like locally in California, they've said they're not going to coach and they're going to disallow during games, heading before 12. That's totally arbitrary. Like Brandy Chastain is an example of a professional female athlete who was working with a group of people to say the national requirement should be before 14. You're not heading a soccer ball repetitively. I mean, when you look at those athletes, there are some that are having, I forget the goalie's name now, who had part of her brain taken out. And there are plenty of soccer athletes too that are on the CTE, penumbrum or whatever.
even that young? They're showing signs and symptoms.
Well, usually when you find brains from people that are 18 into the 20s, it's often because of an accident or suicide and then they're showing early stages of CTE, yes. So the brain degeneration happens over decades, and that shows up as plaque buildups and atrophy in the tissues and deep in the sulci, like brown spots and reduction in volume in some specific and also more widespread areas of the brain. And you can see signs of that even in 18-year-old brains of, so far, athletes and veterans, often accident or suicide related, but early stages like from a brain pathophysiology standpoint.
So what would be your recommendation from the information that you have now? Hold off until mid-20s? In an ideal world, if you could flip a switch and say, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, I mean, in all the sports, it's like, people talk about soccer heading. Like my nephew was 8, 9 and playing like up and was doing like flick on headers and stuff. And when you talk to people about maybe not yet, maybe you should wait, they go, what am I going to do? Like if the ball's coming at my head, I have parents say like, what do you do? Like if the ball's just coming right at you, and I want to be like, like you could duck. I don't want to like there is actually an option. You don't have to let the ball strike you in the head. But it would take a total change in people to decide it was more fun to learn how to play and teach like chest down control of a game. The game would change. In football would look different if everyone played flag or something, for a while beforehand. But you could preserve maybe the better parts of it. And, beyond the sport, it's like we're talking about the riskiest time for the developing brain anyway, related to mood disorders, substance use disorders, things like schizophrenia, impulse control behaviors. Your riskiest time is in adolescence. And like right as you're getting into college, it is the wrong time to be mixing in both brain injuries and also long-term effects from brain injuries. I mean, people are trying to succeed in school. A lot of athletes these days, we have kind of put such an identity on ourselves as athletes. And some people, just even under the best of circumstances, have a really hard time when that very naturally feels like it's dissolving after the end of your high school or college career. I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic, but it's like, if hopefully you're living at least doubly past your 20s. And so it's really unfortunate that people are really feeling it as like an end of times, for them personally. I've had athletes, rugby athletes say to me like, yeah, I've had 6 concussions. So like, what's the point now? I'm going to go hard till I'm old and 25 anyway, and then just like wait it out. And I'm like, dude, you're going to think that till you're like 25 and a day,
That's crazy to have to go
this
through that so
body and
young and be
brain.
dealing with that.
Yeah, and the mentality. Had people look at me and I say, well, try to think of like your kids, and if your kids wanted to do this, and they look at me deadpan and say like, my kid's not playing football. Which you're hearing now from people, but like, and these are people who they're all this stuff that we romanticize, and don't get me into like that moral discussion either, but that was like my ticket out of there or whatever. There's lots of stuff that's wrong about that as being someone's option, but yeah, so it's all sorts of things for people, and it's not just about the sport. I'm reminded it's about like these people becoming individuals and adults, and playing youth sports. What we all say as coaches is we're going to turn out better adults, like better life people, and then at the same time we're making it really impossible in some ways.
And almost crippling those kids at the
Not
same time.
not almost, but in some cases very literally. Yeah. And not just the brain, but the brain. Yeah. So.
Which is the most important thing. I mean, if you lose your brain, what do you have left?
Yeah.
And it's weird. I grew up playing sports, and you're started at such a young age. I mean, I was playing Little League so far back I can't even remember,
Yeah.
and we were just always, you take balls to the face sometimes, soccer
Yeah.
constantly,
Yeah.
basketball.
Yeah.
I never played football. I think my mom was a little afraid of that. She was not down for the contact.
Got lucky.
But in the other ones, you would just brush it off. You get hit in the face, you catch a stray ball, you keep going.
Oh yeah. Yeah, completely. Yeah, and people don't think of that. Like, I've had baseball coaches say like, "Oh, she's here to talk to the other coaches. We don't get concussions in baseball." Meanwhile, like umpires and catchers, there have been whole studies like just on umpires and their long-term effects from getting hit by balls and getting concussions. Lou Gehrig, is in the 30s, so we have no way of really knowing for sure. But he died of Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, which is a degenerative brain disease, which in some studies there's good indication of, when you're looking at the symptoms later in life, there's a question of like the mechanism for getting there. Like, is it the same thing, the same route of injury, the same genetics, or the same whatever to get to that degenerative brain disease that we're seeing these symptoms in that we're calling whatever, or are there maybe one or two or more routes there? And they've found that, in people with repetitive head traumas, a good number of them were diagnosed essentially as ALS, and looking, very different from some other ALS presenters. But Lou Gehrig, I think on the books, and you could check, but it was something like had at least half a dozen documented concussions where the doctors were like, dude, Lou, take a day off. Like, you just got hit with another fastball. And he was known for never taking a day off. And he was, forced to retire and dead in less than a year. Cremated, we'll never know. I mean, for what it's worth, it's not like we could dissect and know for sure in his brain, but there's strong reason to believe that it wasn't unrelated to the fact that he never took a day off after getting hit at least half a dozen times.
And if those are just the documented ones, how many went undocumented?
Yeah, in the 30s. Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, so that kind of stuff is, and whatever, like adults make all sorts of risky decisions all the time, but the adults that feel like they are making those decisions now, or like they can say that that was their decision all along, like that patently was not true for the first 18 years of their life, at least. And, I would argue kind of from a philosophical or moral or whatever standpoint that if you've had 10 years of indoctrination before that point, you're not really making your own unadulterated decision starting at 18, 19, 20, whatever, anyway.
And if you're indoctrinated into the athlete ethos of this is now my identity, I'm an athlete, I'm working out constantly, I'm honing my craft, to try to separate that from the potential harm that comes with it is almost impossible.
It's even impossible in 40-year-old parents that I see, both scared, probably as a parent somewhere inside there. I really believe most of them are, and I can see that in most of them. And also the clashing with, like, what does this mean for me and my life and my, my ethos? Yeah, we don't change our minds easily, especially not when it's something that feels like such an integral part of who we are. And sports are that and have been that for a lot of people. So the kids, I don't think that they really can make that decision. And even outside of sport, like just in it's college age, so late teens, early 20s, kind of early adulthood, as it were. It's just a soupy time anyway. Like I said, even in the best of conditions, like that's when, if you are going to have issues with maybe first bouts of depression or anxiety or sleep issues, or other being away from home or not being away from home or whatever, um, it's like a soupy time anyway.
There's already a lot going on.
Yeah. And from a brain development, the brain is still developing until the mid-20s, even upwards of 30, specifically the frontal cortex, which is like absolutely involved in, among other things, but inhibition control, risk-taking behaviors, top-down sort of thinking, as it were. People have heard that before, but yeah.
So if you say you start out and you're playing Pee Wee football and you go all the way through high school and through college, is it a guarantee that you're going to experience something, either personality-wise or just general behavior or sleep?
Yeah, I would say that is impossible for me to say. I would like to say I hope that that's not true for everybody. On the other hand, if we really had the great sophisticated technologies and nuanced ways of measuring that in a lot of people over a lifetime, I wouldn't say that I'm surprised to learn that almost everybody has some slightly different shift of some
just some
group,
varying degree.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know. I don't know. It would be like a major guess. We haven't been able. People are hard to follow because they have very different lives, and you rely on self-report, and it's hard to do research on minors because you have to get double consent. The parents have to agree to it.
And over a long enough time span where you could actually monitor it would be pretty
right,
challenging.
Right. Yeah. Totally. I can say that I know that there are. I mean, I've done estimates just on our own. Now, how many years? 16 years. And a few thousand every year, baseline tests and otherwise, and then lots of other research. I mean, it is upwards of 20, 30% or more are reporting and obviously having some sort of issue at some point related to repetitive head trauma. It varies a bit sport by sport and gender by gender, but you could also say maybe some sports and some people feel more comfortable reporting than not, so it's not a small
20 to 30% is a lot.
Yeah, and upwards of 40. Even in this was amazing for Del Arte a number of years ago. I got involved going and doing some teacher trainings and outreach with Del Arte, and they are doing a good job of taking care of their students in their master's program there. And within the world of physical theater, before I went to give the talk, I was like, what's the research on physical theater and concussion? And I'll get it slightly wrong, but it was something like 80% of adults who had spent a lifetime in like a theater career have had at least one. And that was not just performers, that was like gaffers and behind the scenes people, I guess, getting hit with boomsticks and, or whatever else. And then like 60% had 3 or more people who had like professional, theater and physical theater type careers. And, it's very much like a show must go on. Sometimes you're the only one or two that can do your role and you have to continue. So that was even surprising to me, that even within, kind of non-sport, things like physical theater, shitty stuff to think about like domestic violence.
Roller coasters?
Certainly in some circumstances, and if people don't have great head control, and we don't know, maybe it's more of a sustained pull and stretch. It's less abrupt, typically. So the stuff that we're seeing is from pretty like abrupt forces, like quick. This is more of like a sustained G-force. I would maybe equate a roller coaster more to like, being in one of those like gravity simulator, like a fighter pilot. Like fighter pilots, it's 6 Gs sustained over time that will cause them to pass out. That's why they wear those suits, to try to keep their pressure, like the Hicklock suits. So, I mean, a roller coaster is less than that, and it's less sustained than that. But it's definitely affecting the push and pull of your tissues. But I don't know that there's any strong evidence to show that it's equal to some of those like more intense abrupt
ones. Mm-hmm. What about, do you get freaked out when you watch, are you an MMA person?
I am not.
The fights?
Yeah.
Does that worry you when you see
Absolutely.
that direct
Oh,
kind of force.
yes. Oh, yes. That's why I don't watch it. Yeah. I don't even like in the movies when they just do like all of the whatever, like pistol whipping or like hitting. I'm like, come on, like just to get somebody's attention or whatever. I mean, like those are serious. More than anything, it's just whatever. If that portrays to some, sorry, kid or idiot, that it would be great, like in some moment of stupidity out at a bar on a weekend to pistol whip some, or like to do those sorts of things. Like I see a lot of people who have fights and others. So like that, not related to sport. So seeing that portrayed in movies gets me. MMA, I mean, again, you can have adults making adult decisions. People fight. I get it. I have again, I've done a lot of like moral searching over the years. I told you about my love of football. I could beat anyone in Madden football circa 2001, from a strategy standpoint. I was a CU fan. I was at the Orange Bowl the year we won, and Rocket got called back for clipping, and I used to drive to the Big 12 championships. And so, I mean, like a football fan, I promise. I told you I had Saint season tickets. I was a Broncos fan growing up. My family had Broncos season tickets like my whole life. I've never watched, when Humboldt had football, I've never watched one of their football games. I've never been to a high school football game here. I've lived here since 2007. I sold my season tickets like I think 2009 or something like that. And I think I had gone back for one game I haven't watched. I can't.
So realizing this stuff has really affected you in that way.
Morally. Yeah, because it's like, why do they do it? And I don't know, and people have their own individual choices, but you can't, but as an ethos, as like a societal thing, they do it because it's, the reason that football got so big in the 70s or whatever in Pittsburgh was because steel went out and the people like needed something to rally around. And so like I get all of that, and I get the like, I do it for the glory, or there's like the gladiator or whatever, but
or even the ticket out, like you mentioned. Like, what if this is, I'm in a shitty town and I want to get out, and maybe I don't have the best grades.
Seems like an option.
And this is the only way.
Yes. And I was at CU when Jeremy Bloom was there, and he had already been a professional skier, and he was forced to like give up his sponsors to come play football at CU because you couldn't be sponsored, yet you were wearing like Nike splattered everywhere. And for the love of football or other college sports, I like the idea that they're not paid, but not, because we pay students all the time to do student work. You could at least pay them to do the student work, or you could pay them as student workers, and because they for sure are. And, I think there's all sorts of exploitation that goes on. And the idea that you're getting a college education most of the time with your ticket out, and that is a lasting thing for you, is bullshit. Like, that happens, but that doesn't happen, for everybody, or often even. Even if you're graduating with a degree, like historically some like big D1s where they're like, yeah, we got you this mambo jumbo combo whatever degree, like, that was all done with tutors turning things in, and the athletes were saying that themselves. Like, it's not like I had an opportunity to study and to learn and to.
Well, and the amount of money that they're bringing in for the schools.
Yeah. So, so all of those moral challenges, and the idea of actually like cheering what I know is like and in the 70s and 80s with the smelling salt kids that would go like, we just didn't have the camera angles. People were coming off like not with it, and then being like, come here, smelling salt, back in, like it was always obvious to at least some people. And I don't think that a high school coming into college, going into, professional football athlete, even at that time, probably would have known what to expect from the pros until they got there. And like I said, a lot of the damage that was setting in for them was slowly setting in for them over time already at that point. It's not because they're professional athletes. It's because they started at 8 or 10 or 12 or whatever. 14 even, But, so I think that just from a moral standpoint, it's been really hard for me to grapple with some of that. And the MMA, it's the same. Yeah, I just can't, for fun, people do self-destructive stuff all the time, myself included. And I like, someone here maybe will listen to this and will know they've seen me on a bicycle without a helmet. But I like to say that I do it just to bring up the point that people have a misconception about concussions and about helmets, because helmets do not prevent concussions. So people choose to do risky things, all laughing aside, myself included. But the idea that every, fighter or whomever is making that choice or been able to make that choice from an informed perspective from the start is not accurate, and I think that that's problematic. So,
Well, I think you could make the argument that even people participating today still don't have enough information to make an informed decision about it.
I think there's no argument. That's for sure true. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah.
It's kind of scary when you think about it.
Super scary. Yeah. And, when you think about and again, we don't know the numbers, it's all speculation, but we know a lot of the crossover when you think of how it impacts not even the individual, but society. So you think about like domestic violence rates or abuse and neglect rates or other things, alcoholism, substance use issues, those are higher in people with repetitive head traumas. From our biggest observed populations now are contact sports and military veterans. So you can't say that sending this person home is not doing any like lasting harm to their families or their communities. It's not only an individual thing. If you have impulse control problems, if you have mental health issues, you're not getting support taking care of those things, those absolutely have ramifications beyond the individual and even beyond the family. Healthcare, the way our healthcare system is set up right now, potentially we're setting these people up to be a drag on a healthcare system that's not going to help them. That's great. Like, there are all sorts of issues with it. And I was going to say something else about the family side of it. And if I think of it, I'll come back to it. But, I do remember there was other kind of speculation, even in people who have mental health issues that might cross over and they have like zero resources. Someone like my mom who had a severe traumatic brain injury. If she had gone what she went through and she didn't have the family support and luck of, circumstance that she had, absolutely she would have ended up without a job, without money, without friends, on the street for sure, probably with a substance use problem. The guesstimates are that a disproportionate number of people who might be struggling in one or more of those ways have had untreated or unhelped or whatever traumatic brain injury or more. So those are, not just about the individual, either. So.
Well, it makes sense because you hear when people undergo something traumatic like a car crash and their personality is shifted or they become depressed or they have these mental health issues, people are like, yeah, it makes sense because they went through something that severe that fast and now they're altered. And it's almost plays into why it's kind of swept under the rug with sports a little bit, because it's not that one instance of, oh, they got hit one time and now they're a different person.
Yeah.
And now their speech is slurring or they're having these issues.
Yeah.
It's a lifetime of trauma.
Yeah, and we love sports. We all want to be like, oh, you got hit. Oh, are you okay? Oh, good. I'm glad you're okay because I really wanted you to be okay.
And we rally when they go back in. Like, that's what uplifts the game. It's, oh, they got hit, they knocked out, and now they're back and they're playing and they're going at it again.
I tell players I would have definitely had to have like a visible bone sticking out of my leg to come out of a game, like, because I taped down or played through absolutely everything else I could have. And if it was like a headache or I couldn't see straight or I felt a little out of it, like, no way. And also I probably wouldn't have realized I should have come out of the game, but no, I wouldn't have thought that was something that you stopped playing through or going to school through or whatever, probably. So yeah, that's definitely intense for people and sobering.
Well, the NFL is the big one that I've always heard in terms of abuse and some violence, is people try to attribute that to the CTE side, or haven't in the past, but are more so doing that now and saying, well, maybe these people are lashing out because they're getting bashed in the head constantly.
Yeah. NFL, but even, in the, NHL, FIFA, world sport organizations, Australian League, whatever, football. I could name more than I could. MMA, everybody, football, American football, or wherever. All of those people have sort of, yeah, probably swept it under the rug. Is that what you're I was like,
Well, I was watching
yeah.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with Aaron Hernandez
Yeah.
and that trial. I started watching the Netflix documentary about that last
Yeah.
night,
Yeah.
and I've only finished the first episode, but from what I remember hearing about it back in the day was that they were trying to touch on the CTE thing, and of course
Yeah.
he also had a pretty rough childhood. There were a lot of other factors going on as well, but it
Yeah.
seemed like
No,
that was something they were trying to weave in there.
for sure the there's very strong evidence to suggest that in examples like Aaron Hernandez or for him, that at that point, the degenerative processes going on in his brain certainly were affecting his mood and his impulse control. It's not to say, I mean, people's always like, oh, well, would they have anyway, or does it turn anyway? I mean, it's not like that. But, similarly, you asked about other people kind of, the military is a big non-sport that I would say, and that's zero disrespect to people who have served in the military or any of the branches of the military, but for sure they also know better and cover up and brush under the rug repetitive head injuries. And then when people come back and they have things like comorbidities of traumatic brain injury and PTSD, they're forced to go through this thing that's like, well, how much of it is the PTSD versus and that's irrelevant and pointless question, to try to like separate or extract for some like monetary or other, the issue is that had a whole human that was exposed, or an attacked human who was exposed to, various things that have now left them with comorbid symptoms and long-term issues that need to be treated as such. And that's true, in professional athletes, and that's true in military veterans. And you would certainly see that affecting people as early as their late teens, early 20s, into their 20s. If it's going to happen, then it hasn't happened, certainly in the 30s and upwards of 40s. I mean, there are lots of examples of people in their 40s and 50s, going to live in a van and, falling into substance use problems and ending in suicide or other. But
Well, and the impulse control is a big factor because people can plead insanity. And
mhm.
so what if these people are doing the things that they're doing not out of their own volition, but because of that trauma? And so they
Mhm.
can't even really separate the decision out of what they should do and what they shouldn't because they don't
Mhm.
have that wall there anymore.
Yeah.
It's just been degraded.
Yeah, and that's a really uh, I can't think of a better word than interesting thing, even from just kind of a legal and a um, community standpoint, how we've looked at harm and punishment. So, like, what is the harm? Harm to the individual, harm to society, and how should we punish? And not to be like contrarian, but all of that is agreed upon subjectively, right? Like, we've just decided, or some people decided, like,
This is
subjectively,
how
but
it is.
yeah, exactly. And that certainly doesn't mean that, again, what you're seeing on one end, blame is also an arbitrary thing. So trying to like assign in some quantitative way blame based on harm and like punishment that should be dealt down, like that's a complicated issue anyway. And it's true that people do horrible things. And it's true that some people who do horrible things do them at a state, because of something that is not in their control at the time. Like how we even used to view things, like in I guess during like Prohibition and after, how we would view like alcoholism just as a lack of will. And we know that that's, and as difficult as it is to sort of, from a personal standpoint, if you yourself or have been affected by someone who suffered from an alcohol use disorder, like it feels a lot different than, maybe what some of the basic brain science is, or non-basic brain science. But, there's something that happens in use disorders, substance use disorders, where the brain is fundamentally changed at that time, under those conditions, to where it's not working under normal will and willpower. It actually looks like a diseased state, brain, not dissimilar from one in, chronic throes of like PTSD or depression or other. Or when you look at, for example, just, blood and oxygen flow, or how they would look at like a heart and show like if you see those like colored images of hearts that are like red and orange versus blue and green and, whatever. So images that are pretty to look at make it clear that, and also much more smaller, nuanced understanding of the nuts and bolts of the mechanisms of things. Um, that it's not just an individual fully, able to make decisions. That there are things changing in their brain that have co-opted their free will, essentially. So then to circle back to like the punishment of things, take something like substance use disorder or a traumatic brain injury or an untreated psychological condition, whether or not they got there by tough childhood or just their own whatever. Like when you're in that state, in actuality, the brain is working differently, and so then it forces us to think about, again, the whole harm and punishment and blame thing. And I guess a really long way of saying it's not easy. But yeah, as much as we want to like say you did it, you're an individual, you deserve all the blame. If we want to operate as that kind of society, I think we also have to be able to hold sort of contradictory things in our mind and understand that whatever, it's not black and white, So.
Which everybody wants it to be.
Oh
Because
yeah.
it makes it simpler if it's, you could just look at it and say, oh no, this person is bad because of X. And they did this because they wanted to do this and they're just a terrible person.
Yeah.
Rather than looking at, okay, what are the circumstances surrounding that?
Yeah.
What have they gone through and where did that kind of diverge for them?
The brain loves to separate and categorize, and unfortunately things often turn out like very polar, like red, blue, left, right, up, down, right, wrong. And I think people have a really difficult time holding contradictory truths, in their mind, or looking at a body of evidence and saying, okay, arbitrary numbers, I think we have about 60-70% of this figured out. It's not all of it, but we have some strong evidence. I think that means we should go with this evidence and hopefully get some more evidence, but this makes sense, versus like, can't tell me for sure, we know nothing, so I'm going to go back to the dark age. So in the beginning, in concussions and brain injury, people would say, well, you can't see it, you don't know, or whatever, so it just like must not be true. Or isn't it true that so-and-so played and they didn't have, and like, so it must not be true. And it's obviously not that simple.
Do you still experience a lot of that pushback when you try to disseminate this information to people, or to parents especially?
Less. Yeah, I've had to have a good number of just like looking at people and going like, oh, like someone saying like, I had concussions and I'm fine. Like a parent that's aggravated about me telling them that their child shouldn't be playing, this Friday or whatever. I'm fine. And I've had to say like, okay, well, sir or madam, like, fine may be relative, like, have you always had these aggression issues? Or, whatever. It's hard when I have parents sometimes say things like, well, he was stupid anyway.
Oh, that's
Or,
not what you want to hear.
No, I'm just like, all right, just, yeah, you need to leave now. Like, I can't. So it's like that, that happens. And that I want to get the kid and be like, you need to find a way to survive the next 4 years. And then you need to get out of here. And no, I don't actually say that, but like, don't listen to these people. They don't care about your long-term health. I do often tell them like, look, all of the, friends and people who you're in with now in high school, like it feels like a really big deal. I understand like the way that time works, even like every day of your life feels like a really big deal when you've had less days of feeling adult-ish. But that, when you get out of high school, like none of this is going to matter in the long term to your brain. And these people care about you, but like it's your brain, like parents, family, whatever, like this is you, this is your brain, this is your long-term health. Like you need to be thinking about that. So I do definitely tell that to people.
Yeah, that's going to be a hard pill to swallow. And the other thing, we keep touching on the sports aspect, but it's the money that is wrapped up in its potential if you can go the distance. That kind of incentivizes people not necessarily to care about you, but to care about what you can do long term.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like the whole system is just rigged to kind of just keep pushing you down if you can make it, and just tape yourself up, keep going.
Yeah.
Because there's a finish line if you can get there.
Yeah. And we definitely, generally, I mean, there's a reason why, I understand there are a lot of 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds who are still playing sports, but there's a reason why people don't typically pick up a sport for the first time at the age of 25, or whatever. Or, like when you're young and you're joining something that's like a part of your identity, and it gets, it's like that's part of growing up and doing that. And then if you're still doing it when you're older, it's because you love it, and hopefully, and or not, but you part of your identity. And there are fewer people who just like decide to go find that if it's not something that they've had. So, uh, what was your initial, you were saying in the middle? Oh, the money, the incentive. That's right. Yeah. So people believe from a young age that the possibility is there. The numbers are not on their case. Like I've taught seminar classes with, 80 freshman athletes. This was at HSU, a decade ago, and we'd have like 80 athletes in there. And I'd be like, okay, cool. Nice to meet everybody. Say hello. I could go. So just by show of hands, like how many of you are planning to go professional in your sport? Like every single one of them raised their hands. And I said, like, I love you all. I'm here to tell you exactly this many of you will be going pro. Maybe, but probably, and that was a 0 and a 1. If anyone's just listening, 0, maybe 1, 0, probably not. So, and like look around and like, look left, look right, whatever, and I'm saying that to you from a, hopefully like an empowering, realistic, like you need to think about other things too, like enjoy the sports, but like that's not going to be the reality. So, if it's a kid that just knows from the start that they're going to be that, then yeah, I guess it's tough to separate. But for the vast majority of people who think that are playing high school and college sports that think they're going to go pro or playing in some pursuit of money because it's enticing, like, yeah, maybe the informed consent needs to be some pure math. Maybe people just need to show them the numbers. And I think at a young age, you still think like, but I'll be the one,
Yeah, it's hard to separate
So,
that.
everybody thinks they're a better than average driver. It's not statistically possible. So, I think trying to just tell people that in a supportive way so that we can actually help them become great individuals, as adults. Diversify their portfolio, as it were, so that even if it's not ahead, like what if you break your leg and you just can't ever run again? Like what could you do potentially to, scratch that itch, as it were? And I think that like adaptive aspect of sports and play that we kind of say like, oh, you learn to like work through adversity. They also show that some of the best athletes now, they don't encourage sport specialization in young kids anymore. They encourage kids to do more than one sport, both from a joints and limbs and also from a just like developmental standpoint, to not feel so stuck in one or attached to one.
Well, and it's challenging because you almost need that level of unfounded belief in yourself to actually go the distance. You need to just have this unrealistic belief that you will achieve what you put your mind to. And
Yeah.
some people do make it, but it's not the norm.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
especially when you get into something like the NBA or the NFL.
Yeah.
We're talking about a fraction of people that play those sports get there, but you have to believe that you can get there, otherwise you won't.
Yeah, at one time it was like less than like 1% or 2% of college athletes went pro. I don't know what it is now, but
Which is crazy. 1%.
Yeah, 2 maybe, but I don't know what the current stats are, but that was, I'm always off on years. Maybe that was a decade ago, but not all that long ago. And yeah, so needing to be able to do other things, but also, yeah, like you said, thinking that you have a chance is really important. I also think that that's a really good thing to learn. Just like for me, there's empowerment in like the lack of individuality or in the fact that I'm not a special unicorn. It's a lot of pressure if you're a special unicorn. So it's like, realizing that you're human, I think is helpful. But that's not, how we set up some of the sport or other, whether it's like competitive dance or instruments or, whatever, but that's not how we set up a lot of our like competitive play or getting into good jobs in schools. It's like we put a lot of value on what we consider sort of these like, expert productive things. Yeah. There was something else I was going to say about the kids, but
In terms of the military, are you noticing similar levels of TBIs as compared to athletes, or more for those that are directly experiencing combat? Are you guys looking
Both.
a lot of that research?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, yeah, certainly. I mean, just from a educational standpoint, I do, and then we have had crossover research with DARPA and the DoD, and then students who have also gone on to do more crossover research with DARPA and the DoD. And I can tell you just based on like the blast injuries, from our most recent and longest wars going on almost 2 decades going on, maybe more, since the use of like IEDs and explosives have certainly like catapulted the number of traumatic brain injuries. The physics of a blast wave through the architecture of the brain is pretty trippy, and it is a bit different than like an impact in a collision sport. The wave mechanics, the way that the waves would like travel through and then also potentially bounce off a wall and come back, couple double on itself. And also how it works through the white matter of the brain has a lot of very long electrical cords, as it were, that are kind of they're white because they're wrapped in a fatty layer, and there's a lot of water, and and the idea now is that the way that the waves mechanic work through some of those tissues of the brain uniquely disrupt them, perhaps compared to some other injuries. And then also within the military, you have a lot of people who have also played a contact sport or had a brother, or even in some military realms where now they're maybe getting away from it a bit, but where like boxing is a required course for like a first year in like the Navy, for example. And that actually, if you had to pause the course because of concussion, you were forced to like retake it as soon as you were like the next semester. We can't just say that it's only from seeing combat, but absolutely combat related. And then large like shoulder launch rockets, people like mortarmen who are having large blasts near their head, or IEDs have totally changed brain injury. And there are a huge number of veterans identified and not identified, not properly identified or helped, that are suffering from traumatic brain injuries.
Yeah, just not willing to come forward in
No,
some
or
regard.
coming forward and not getting help. Coming forward and being met with, oh, well, is this the PTSD, or is this
Oh,
or
you really hurt?
can
Do
you
you
prove the
really?
date,
Yeah.
or was it we show that you were a little further from that than, or you didn't mention it at the time, all sorts of stuff.
In terms of severity, are those blasts worse than, say, a collision with a football player, or it's just a different type of impact?
Different, yeah. Even within, like, for example, some of the instantaneous impact forces that we measure, like, for example, the G-force, which is how many times the force of gravity. Like, there have been accelerometer studies in football athletes that have shown that they routinely experience anywhere between like 10 and 120 Gs, upwards of 200 Gs, sometimes even more, and that concussions can occur at 40 Gs, at 90 Gs, and somehow not at. So you're relying on both measuring the forces and then also being able to like ask that athlete, like, how do you feel? And that particular athlete like may or may not notice or may not report, or if it was a retrospective study, maybe they didn't report it at the time. So it's sort of difficult, but we know that those G forces can happen even in high school kids 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 times a week at levels that technically are, concussions can be documented at. And then there's this whole idea of subconcussive blows. So, the way now that we diagnose a concussion firstly is by observed signs or reported symptoms. So someone has to like present seeming like they maybe have a concussion. And then that's how we would go on to try to, document that it was an injury. But there's a question of these subconcussive blows, repetitive stuff that happens across days or seasons or longer, and what cumulative effects that may have if the brain is, say, in a disrupted state, but not to such a obvious degree. And we know now that, like some of the CTE stuff, and the one paper that I was talking about, the hits, not concussions that can cause CTE. There have been newer papers since still, but found, for example, an 18-year-old had a brain of an 18-year-old that had been donated, and they found early signs of CTE in that brain. And the mother, it's just reporting what she heard or remembers, but still said the child never had a concussion, did play football. I think was the only one in that with contact sport or whatever. And I guess looking back, maybe had a bell ringer or something or two, but never anything like obvious or documented. And, for sure. And then now we've had hundreds of brains since then, for sure showing early signs of the tauopathy. Yeah.
Is there anything you can do to reverse those symptoms once they start to express? So, like, if you are getting a concussion or repeated concussions and you start to notice some changes, is there any way to roll that back, or it's really you just got to stop what you're doing and try to take time?
The very best thing to do, well, initially we can like minimize. So the sport and like what could we potentially do if we just kind of had relevant rule changes within each sport to certainly reduce maybe entirely all of the elective blows and try to protect against the inadvertent ones or whatever. Generally that would be good. And then beyond then, the biggest thing is sort of the education and outreach, or at least the understanding among all of the athletes, hopefully parents, coaches, whatever, that recognizing something immediately and stopping immediately is the best way to, also the shortest and fastest way back to participation, is just stop. Like in the game, practice, whatever, recognize it, go, yep, you're done. It's like the whole idea that someone could be showing signs of a concussion that are obvious enough to get them pulled off the field, and then there's some sideline assessment that rules that they can go back in, is one of the biggest misconceptions and things that I've had to like work against for the last decade. Like, that's ludicrous. The idea that someone, first of all, if it's obvious enough that they're saying something or someone's seeing something, they're having symptoms, they're coming out, there's just no question that no individual at no age should continue to play that day. Zero. There's zero evidence to suggest that they should play that day. So it's like always stop and then assess. And, stopping early is what helps people get a handle on things, maybe only have a couple days of monitoring. Your question of can you beat it back or how can you best support is to stop, kind of assess, certainly medical attention, make sure there's nothing serious going on. And then restful home activity. Can I do full kind of home life? Then full like cognitive life, whether that's work or school or whatever. And you're like grading back in across days, and then you grade back into physical activity across days. So sometimes that can happen. There's laws now in every state. In the state of California, it's true too. If a kid is suspected of having an injury, say on a Friday, they're supposed to be removed from play. And even if they were turned around by like a medical doctor, like within a day, and said, you're good to begin the graded return process, the graded return process takes a minimum of a week, which pushes them out of the subsequent week's game. And that's by law in California and in other states. And that is 100% based in evidence. It's not going to get any, the guideline won't get any softer than that, only maybe more strong, if that makes sense. And then, even for adults, stop should go through a graded return process. Maybe somehow you could argue that a professional football player could play like the next week or something. Probably not usually, but fine. But stop for the day, not play for the day is definitely rule number one. And then grading back in first to kind of like general cognitive, physical stuff successfully across days without symptoms coming back. That's how we can best tease out that underlying disruption vulnerability is recovering. There's a lot of research now at like what happens when you're a few weeks out and you're still having symptoms and you're an athlete. Like, does getting back into some aerobic activity actually help you get back out there sooner? I kind of hope that that's the case, and people should keep researching it. The truth is that the subjective reporting of symptoms is not at all the primary concern. The primary concern is what's happening, at the brain level that we can't see. So I believe that running might make you feel a little bit better. I don't know that it's safe to say that you feeling better means your brain is recovered to a point where it's safe to put you back out into a contact scenario. if that makes sense. If you've heard about like return protocol where, even with symptoms, they're like grading them back into some sort of exertional protocol kind of thing, and that they find that physical activity helps people with headaches. This is usually like a little further out. Um, you know, I don't think it's even safe to say that that subjective feeling of feeling better is necessarily coinciding with your total, brain recovery.
Your actual state.
Yeah, we
And
don't
s
know that. Yeah.
and so no additional treatment-based options that you could do to supplement, at least right now. It's really
No,
just take the time and don't do anything to make it worse.
pretty much. Yeah. I mean, like generally good nutrition, there are people who market like supplements, which are just not the supplement world generally is
A little
difficult and
dicey.
unregulated and also, and we can't study even, nutritionists and dietitians exist to help people primarily who are in like disordered or disease states, like how to help somebody who's a cancer patient or whatever, not for like, I don't want to assume you, but you or I who probably maybe generally process things relatively well and don't have any like acute allergies or something. It's the idea that we know that titrating little nutrients and it does X, Y, Z. Like, we just don't know that fundamentally. So then from there, supplements are obviously also an issue and unregulated in what they're able to say or not say. But to that same vein, there are things that do appear to be pretty benign that they put into all sorts of supplements. For example, like DHA, which is one of the fatty acids. Fish get it from algae. So you don't have to take fish oil, but there are things like that some people will take, say for like cognitive health. They put them in prenatal vitamins for like neural tube development. There's not a lot of strong evidence to say one way or the other. And even when you're looking at cognitive stuff, remember that's just like one subsection of symptoms. And then in some like Eastern countries, I know there's more look at like curcumin or turmeric and stuff, sort of like to a similar vein, seems pretty benign. Da, 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 da.
What about something like
So,
lion's mane or even more abstract like psilocybin or something based like that?
well, I mean, those are, yeah, the psilocybin. I don't know, the lion's mane I would put with the sort of like turmeric and DHA stuff for right now, where like maybe starting to make sense, maybe in some circles. Also, not everyone can, there's not a lot of money going to studying those things because there's not a lot of money to be made off of like selling them. They're readily available, right? So some of it is also an issue with how we fund research or don't fund research. But maybe more towards that promising but not much knowledge. Some groups of people are learning more. And also probably not harmful. Question of if wasting your money is harmful, but and then from the psilocybin standpoint, I mean, as far as we can tell, like non-abuse, non-addiction, non-abuse forming, non-habit forming, less harmful substances like psilocybin or maybe LSD or some related things. Can show all sorts of promise in treating, symptoms, all sorts of sleep and mood type symptoms. As far as acute symptoms of concussion in the brain, I would say there's just zero evidence for that. And one other concern, primarily whether it's things like alcohol or nicotine or caffeine, even for that matter, is it all affects the chemistry in the brain. And so since your brain is already in a vulnerable state, having a difficult time with its basic chemistry and electricity, struggling to do what it just normally does. I also think you should be careful and cautious in knowing that anytime you're introducing something else, you're, if anything, just making more work for the brain potentially. So there's also not, I don't think, a reason to believe that things like cannabis potentially or maybe psilocybin under the properly, dosed and titrated things would be harmful, but just no evidence one way or the other. Alcohol for sure, is harmful.
I think just
And
across
it's
the board, people are
across the
starting to
board, and
realize
it's
that.
really harmful after traumatic brain injury.
What about sauna? I thought I read maybe on your guys' website that you don't want to engage in that
Oh,
after.
yeah, that's cute. So we're redoing our website too, and we've done, and just so that everybody knows, our website is always usually kind of like an ongoing student project. So we had a Wix site that is now converting to our Cal Poly site. And generally speaking, the idea behind sauna or hot tub or whatever would be, again, just changing the blood flow, temperature regulation. Like your body and brain already have to worry about temperature regulation and blood flow, and that is taxing in an additional way that's not helpful.
So really just not focusing on not adding more stress to a system that's currently trying to repair itself is the
Yeah.
biggest thing.
Yeah, I'm simply put, for sure. Yeah. Remembering to eat snacks and to hydrate because, your brain normally burns through a lot of energy anyway. And when it's recovering, that happens too. Even if you're sleeping a lot, sometimes people aren't like eating often or they don't have an appetite. And so like just remembering to keep up with nutrition and hydration and general rest. And, there's been a lot, people have said like, oh, you don't need to do cocoon therapy. There were some like really headlines within the last handful of years. It's like cocoon therapy is not indicated after concussion. And I was like, well, yeah, duh. No one has been doing cocoon therapy. But if anyone ever thought the idea was that absolutely everyone had to like go into a dark closet and not come out for 3 days, like that's not true.
Is that cocoon therapy? I've never heard of that.
Yeah. Or like, yeah, that's it. And so that's never, well, at least for the last couple, no one's been recommending that. Maybe for some people who are having really bad visual symptoms and just need the dark and the quiet, then absolutely. But the idea that everyone should just like go and isolate in a dark and quiet room is not indicated. It's a matter of assessing and figuring out what your symptoms are and how you can keep them minimized. You can avoid making them worse or at least stable as you're slowly like grading back into life.
What about
Days.
sleep post TBI? Is that because I've always heard if somebody gets concussed or has something happen, you want to try to keep them awake. Is that true?
That's another thing that's not always true. The reason that was indicated is because if someone fell asleep, but say then they lost consciousness, you wouldn't know that if they were asleep. So the concern is just that they would go to sleep and then lose consciousness. Or if someone were really in a bad way where they were like losing consciousness, potentially vomiting, and they could aspirate or something. But so as long as you are not having the types of symptoms where you're like having trouble staying awake just when you should otherwise be able to stay awake, or you're like losing consciousness, or if you were like slurring your speech or kind of any other concerns related to that, like some more severe symptoms. And then for anyone, you just want to be like monitored, like don't be left alone. So just like go be with someone who will check on you and can also make sure that you're haven't lost consciousness in the middle of the night.
So another strike against the cocoon theory. I think it's pretty clear. Just
Yeah.
don't self-isolate alone in the dark. Have somebody
Yeah.
check up on you.
Yeah, totally. And but the idea that you would like, I have kids all the time and I'm like, well, how are you? And they're like, well, I'm really tired because my mom woke me up every 20 minutes just to make sure that I was still conscious. And, based on the symptoms they were having, that probably wasn't indicated. But the reason that was recommended at times is just concern for people who would be losing consciousness while they were sleeping. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm thoroughly kind of scared about the state of the world in sports with the concussion
know.
program now.
I'm sorry.
No, I think it's good that the information is getting out there. I think that's a key factor in people being able to make an informed decision is we have to at least start to present them with the facts of, okay, this is what we know right now.
Yeah.
Might change more in the future, but we're going to show you. Like,
Yeah.
this is important. People should know. Kids, again, it's just dicey because they're kids. So can they make an informed decision? First off, can the parents make that decision? Sports are so ingrained in, especially our country, and what it means to,
Yeah.
grow up as an American. You play sports.
Mhm.
You go out, you play a variety of them, and then you just keep pursuing maybe
Mhm.
through high school into college. And so to kind of tweak that frame or the lens in which we're viewing that is, I mean, it's a challenge, I would imagine, for sure.
Yeah, it is. I think trying to keep it fun, keeping kids interested in other things. It's a lot of times been about keeping kids busy. Initially, like get the schools out early. Parents are still working. Like, what do kids do for 2 hours after school? Kind of thing. Camaraderie, working hard, all of those things. But there's a lot within the kids' sport world that is also maybe swung in a different direction from that initial ethos. Like, I'm sorry, but sometimes it's moms, but like dads, following each other to their cars, like after a 8-year-old soccer game, just is all kinds of wrong. So, yeah, we don't trust kids to make informed decisions. We've decided fundamentally that they can't make informed decisions. Their brains are not formed. And but sometimes I meet kids and I'm like, I really wish that you were the one making the decision, because adults who just very naturally have their blinders up and are defensive of their way of life don't make good decisions. So, yeah, it's a big challenging thing. I wish if I could snap a finger, it would just be like change the environment and the rules as much as possible. And then even in sports, like softball, volleyball, anything, just say like, I say to teammates, I say, look, if someone gets hurt, they might not even recognize it themselves. This is like, everyone needs to look out for each other, because this is a long-term, brain issue. And the fastest way that you're going to get your teammate back for the next game or whatever is to help them recognize it immediately and get them out, for the day. So, and that has changed some over the last, 12 years. I forget, there was I want to say it was a kid, but maybe it wasn't a kid, handful of years ago, who got in touch with me and published maybe it was a little like Time Standard piece or something that did a little survey at the high schools and said something like, did you know that up to 40% of concussions are going unreported? Like, he basically had gone around and interviewed probably at Eureka and maybe some other schools, athletes, and found out like how many were reporting or not reporting. And then he'd run some calculation and it was like 40% of concussions go unreported. And this was half a dozen years after we'd started the program. And I was like, that's amazing. Like, I want to believe your math, let's just say that. And that's way better than 60%, 80% that it was, a few years ago. So if it's only 40% of concussions that are going unreported based on your math, I am stoked about that. So, but that is changing some. And honestly, in a community like this, as parents start to, because you're all at the game together and they talk to each other. So if a parent sees a parent be supportive in one way or call another parent out, or, it's kind of effectively like mandatory reporting when you have so many kids out there. It's like whether it's the coach or the ref or another athlete or someone sees something, they should say something. And people like to say like, oh, well, what about the strategy of then going over and saying you saw a kid get hit and needs to be pulled for concussion and he doesn't because he's their star player. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that happens on occasion. And those people are like, idiots, but that's not what we're designing our idea around. We're not like going to change all the rules to account for like the one time that someone's going to abuse it. And, so.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to see what you guys keep doing up there. I think it's a noble pursuit in a lot of ways. You guys are putting in some good work. Fighting the good fight, you could say.
It's been fun. It works out well because of the community and just the size and the support. And hopefully we'll have I would like to not be necessary, the job. So hopefully we just have more and more people who are just generally aware and helping to make good decisions.
And it'll be interesting to see how that shifts in society as more people do get aware. If sports change in some way, maybe the flag football thing, at least in practice, like those small shifts, it'll be interesting to see if those take place and people's acceptance to kind of change what the sports look like.
Yeah, I hope. I hope. And there are lots of reasons that humans are not very good at.
People don't like change, period, for very small things, for places that they eat, let alone for changing things that they hold like sports. So, I mean, sports fans are a different breed when they're really about it.
Yeah, totally. I sometimes will say to parents, sort of rhetorically and just knowingly, that not many would kind of counter, but just saying, yeah, I know. I tell them about when I was young and I played and the visible bone thing, or like, I totally get it. And I'm like, but none of us have kids thinking like, I want you to grow up in a world exactly like the world I grew up in. Like, no one goes, "I want things to be exactly how exactly for my children how they were for me." I mean, maybe they might think that romantically, but, like, no, the whole point is, like, some progress or some change. Like, we can get new knowledge and decide to do things better for our children. And when I say it, better than that, but pretty simply to parents, they're like, "Oh, yeah, I totally want progress for my child,"
It'd be a little alarming if they're like, "No, I don't think so.
Yeah,
I'm okay with it
a
staying the
few,
same."
a few, but yeah.
Okay, well, Beth, I appreciate you coming on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks. You were very patient. I know I talk too much, but thank
No, it was
you.
good. I mean, this is the perfect format for that. Do you want to plug where people can find you, where they can find the North Coast Concussion Program, all your resources?
Absolutely. Yeah, great. We're at Cal Poly Humboldt in the School of Applied Health. You can get to our website that's shifting now to, it should be like, let's see, kra.humboldt.edu/NCCP. So we're the North Coast Concussion Program. You can email us at nccp@humboldt.edu. Our phone number is 707-826-4540. And I would say, we talk a lot about sports, we've talked a lot about youth, but we're here for the entire community. We're a resource for everybody. So even if you're just interested or curious or you have questions, you can get in touch. We're happy to work with adults, non-athletes, anybody. And you don't have to have a referral or anything. You can just get in touch, and we'd be happy to chat.
All right. Thanks, Beth.